We actually we're playing musical physician assistants today. Jeremy Daly is there actually instead from Tripp Family Medicine. Uh, Russell probably is working on some other project, right?
That's right.
Make sure I got the right microphone here, Jeremy. Try again.
That's right.
There you go. You sound much better. I could hear you, but it just wasn't coming in as loud as it should. We're talking today about fatigue. Uh, a lot of people know this subject, and a lot of people it's probably just not getting enough sleep, but there's certainly, obviously, a lot of potential causes, I would imagine, right?
That's right. And it's one of those things that's pretty multifaceted. A lot of people they struggle with it, and it really affects their lives. And that's really why I wanted to talk about it today, is because so many people they suffer from fatigue. A lot of statistics show that actually about 20% of people that come into the clinics in general, they suffer from fatigue, and it really affects their daily life.
I just had a message the other day from a friend of mine who moved to Alabama as a medical professional and raised children too as well, and joked the other day. She said, "I'm going to take a nap today." She said, "Because I haven't been able to do it for about 25 years." Uh, but that happens to be a lot of the issue is people just simply don't get an opportunity to rest, right?
Yeah, that is a big problem, just not getting enough sleep. And we call that physiologic fatigue, where they're not getting enough sleep, they're not maybe exercising or dieting the way that they should. And so, yeah, it affects them. But really, today I wanted to talk about what we call secondary causes of fatigue. And those are
Mm-hmm.
things that we can really do a lot for people when it comes to these causes. So, a few of the things that I wanted to talk about today, there's really three topics that really I think a lot of people are interested in nowadays. One of them is obstructive sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is kind of a common term we hear a lot. The other one is it's depression. It's a really common cause of fatigue, and the last one is thyroid disease. And all of those things they make people feel fatigued. And we try to differentiate between people feeling sleepy and people feeling fatigued. When you're sleepy, you can be aroused with exercise or
Mm-hmm.
activity or movement and things like that. Fatigue, when you start to do things, you feel more tired, and it usually lasts for a longer period of time versus, sleepiness is usually due to not getting enough sleep or rest or
And, you bring that up. I think I set the record on the meter when I went to the sleep center and I spent the night and I had 100 and I think two apneas in 1 hour. And then I had a friend and coworker. He was driving down the Long Island Expressway one day and realized suddenly he was falling asleep during his drive. Um, these are issues, and you might be doing something outside, working in the garden, and you just suddenly feel I can't keep doing this, right?
exactly, yeah. And that's a great point. In the research I was doing preparing for this, and I've done some research on sleep apnea before, but a lot of the fatalities and accidents with big commercial vehicles are due to people who develop sleep apnea over time. And that's a lot of times the demographic that we're looking at. We're
Mm-hmm.
looking at males, we're looking at men that are over 40, and that are overweight. Those are really the big three things that we look for obstructive sleep apnea. Now, of course, you can have it in anyone. Even infants actually can develop obstructive sleep apnea. Sometimes it's anatomical, and that's really what we look for when we do an exam is there something going on here that's causing an obstruction. And really, during the night, the tongue relaxes, falls into the back of the throat, and pushes on that soft palate and basically occludes the airway. So you're not getting any breathing.
Jeremy Daly is our guest from Tripp Family Medicine here in Twin Falls. It's coming up on 8:38, and it's 38. Before we get to the break, I believe we have a telephone caller. And caller, you've got a question or comment for the physician assistant? Nope, I think we've lost our caller in that situation, but we'll invite calls following the other side of the break as well. Should point out Tripp Family Medicine. One thing that the other folks who come in like to mention is there's always room for more patients, and it's easy to contact the office, isn't it?
It is. It is. It's one phone call and you're right to the front desk, and they can turn around and say, "Hey, do you have room on your schedule today?" And they're really good about knowing how many spaces we have left. But we always want to get people in as quick as we can. If it's not today, then it's tomorrow. But right now we're really we have a lot of open spaces right now where I'm new, and
You created those.
yeah, I'm created those spaces, and I would love to fill them. I'd love to see the people here in the Magic Valley, and um, we love seeing new patients. It's what we like to do. Like to meet new people and take care of them.
And easy to find too on Fillmore Street, across from the main post office and the building itself, with lots of windows and just very friendly in a children's space too, which we should point out. A lot of folks wonder how they keep the kids busy. There you go. You go in and there's an opportunity for them to watch some movies and some videos and the like.
That's right. We have to make sure Dr. Tripp doesn't get in there and get in the videos and the toys, but
he likes the Disney films.
That's right. That's right.
It's come a long way from my days when the story Bible was all you had to entertain the children in the doctor's waiting room. We've got more coming up, and Jeremy, you're going to go into more depth about this, obviously, too, in the next few minutes. Jeremy Daly joining us from Tripp Family Medicine, and keep in mind you can give us a call right after the break. I know we've got people trying to get through, but you can wait a couple of minutes, and we'll take your telephone calls. That's on the way. Also on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. We have a guest in studio with us. Jeremy Daly is a physician assistant. He's joining us today from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls. We call it Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. It's 8:43 and it's 38 and still a little windy outside. We have a telephone caller too looking to join us as well. And you're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX. Good morning.
Good morning to you. I have a question. I have a high ferritin level, and I was wondering what he had as an advice.
I'm sorry, you said you have a high ferritin level?
Ferritin. Yeah, high level of iron. 938.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of things that can cause an increase in ferritin. So, ferritin is really one of the ways that the body stores iron, right?
Right.
So, I would say that that's something that needs to have some more testing done to determine what's actually causing the ferritin level to be elevated. Iron's kind of an interesting thing because we need it, but our body doesn't get rid of it very well. So, there's a lot of ways we can take in too much iron, through the diet or supplementation. And, there's even some diseases that can cause your ferritin level to go up. Or overall iron levels to go up, and they need to be worked up definitely by your primary care doctor to see why they're elevated. To have to come to a conclusion as to why. It may not be anything of great concern, but definitely it requires more of a workup and investigation to figure out why it's elevated.
Okay, and am I a candidate for blood donations?
That's a good question. I know that actually some people who have too much iron in the blood, one of the ways they get rid of it is actually to do bloodletting, so to speak, getting rid of some of the blood. It's therapeutic phlebotomy, but I don't know if that would be in order for you. I would say definitely figure out why you have this elevated ferritin level first. Meet with your primary care doctor and try to figure out why it's elevated, and then determine is it something where it's safe enough to donate your blood. And if they feel like it is, then definitely. But I would figure out why it's elevated before that time.
Okay. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Want to thank you for the call. Speaking of iron, back in the early 90s, I was covering a court case, and I was talking to one of the reporters from one of the other TV stations, and I mentioned I'd been tired a lot lately, and she started asking me about my diet. And she was not a medical professional, but obviously had heard this from one, and she said, "You're not getting enough iron." And she said, that was making me tired. So there are a lot of different factors that could lead to fatigue. We could probably cite hundreds of them ultimately, right?
Yeah, certainly. And being anemic is definitely a cause, but I would say it's less common, and it can be ruled out with a simple blood test. And just like that can be ruled out with a simple test, some of these other things can be ruled out with a simple test as well. As far as ruling out something like sleep apnea, we do what's called polysomnography, or a sleep study, basically. And you can do an overnight type study, or there's even people nowadays that are able to do it in their own home, and they are sent the equipment and they can hook themselves up, and they do a 3-day study in their home, and we can actually get those numbers sent directly to the company that does it. And it's great because, when you go to a sleep study lab, sometimes it can be kind of sterile, and it's definitely not your own bed. And so we've gotten some really good results from patients who have gone to those sleep studies, and once we diagnose them with the sleep apnea, it's easily treatable. you know Things that we definitely recommend, a lot of times, increasing exercise and losing weight, and sometimes even people who have large tonsils, having those tonsils taken out is a treatment as well. But a lot of times we use what's called a CPAP, and that just stands for continuous positive airway pressure, and basically just forces this air down your throat all night long and into your mouth, and you know it keeps you breathing, keeps you from having those apneic episodes where you actually stop breathing during the night, or you stop breathing as much as you should, and your oxygen levels go down to the brain. And so it's something that we like to diagnose and treat because it's dangerous.
I should point out, being that I'm familiar with that. On a personal note, it also takes out a lot of the ambient noise you might get otherwise that would disturb your sleep, just because you've got the sound of that quiet sound of the air going on, and you might not hear trains going by down the road or something else that could wake you up during the night. So it gives me, in that sense, a very restful night's sleep. That it's not just the breathing any longer, but it's also the fact that I wouldn't hear a lot of noises in the neighborhood that might interrupt me at that point.
Yeah, and I think that, the noise is good, and sometimes the mask takes some getting used to. If you've never been a fighter pilot, then probably it will take you a couple of weeks to accommodate the mask. But after that, I think most people, like you said, they like the ambient noise. And I've had some experiences where people in my own family have had sleep apnea, and the results from getting that CPAP, they felt like they hadn't slept in years, and then all of a sudden they're feeling like a new person, feeling energized, and the fatigue was resolved with the CPAP. And you know that's really what we want to do, is make people feel better, make people feel like they're not fatigued, and that they can you know do their jobs and be with their family and friends, and not feel like they want to fall asleep or go hide in their room and take a nap.
There probably are other things that could obviously cause this. Sometimes somebody, we hate to mention the word cancer or tumors, but sometimes people have other reasons and they don't even know that this is developing, and that causes fatigue, doesn't it?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, we those are some of the things that we definitely work up with fatigue. Blood tests a lot of times can rule that out. Good medical histories, kind of putting things together, and sometimes it does take a while to rule out different causes before we get to the bottom of it. But just like I mentioned earlier, a really common cause is depression, and men and women both, they present differently with depression. A lot of men, they just feel fatigued, um, and a lot of women, they feel they feel anxious, they feel the actual what we think of as depression a lot of times. But people come in feeling fatigued, and we talk to them, and we get a good history, and we do some questionnaires, and a lot of times we can do trials of medications, and if we see improvement with that, then that could be a way to treat the fatigue, and ultimately overcome that.
Jeremy Valley is our guest from Tripp Family Medicine this morning, and you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. We call it Better Health when we have the guests come by from the doctor's office right here on Top Story as well. 8:51, and coming up, temperature is still holding steady at 38. It should get warmer today by about 4 or 5 degrees. One other thing you mentioned, it caught my attention earlier when you talked a little bit about some of the accidents we have on the roads that are caused by this fatigue. There are a lot of people. My uncle was a long haul truck driver, and in those days, no one really paid much attention to how often you were on the road, and they didn't have these GPS units to sort of report back to the terminal what was going on, and so these guys would keep their own logs, handwritten logs, and there was a lot of what was called, I think they called it gunboating in parts of the country, but essentially they would keep false logs because they could make more money by driving all night. Shift workers would have these issues too, because you don't have a regular sleep pattern. And so, when I was working overnight shifts on a couple of different jobs, and sometimes weekends, you're trying to adjust, you're always tired. You're always feeling you don't have the energy.
Yeah, and that's really, a lot of that is the physiologic fatigue that we talked about, that can be resolved with rest once you kind of get out of that schedule. And I worked in the ER as well, Uh, so I know what it's like to work some shift work and you know work some back-to-back shifts where you feel like you're kind of a zombie, I would say. And you know, usually after I got out of that shift or had a few days off, I was able to resolve that fatigue, and that's really um, one of the differentiations we try to make between physiologic fatigue and the secondary fatigue that we're talking about, the things that we can actually treat with something other than rest.
I was going to say for people who come to your office, you mentioned you do blood tests.
Mhm.
You can go do the sleep study, but are there other causes or other things you need to identify as well sometimes?
Yeah, yeah, there are, and that's why we try to do a detailed history with everyone that comes in. We try to really get to know their situation because fatigue a lot of times is multifaceted. Somebody could be experiencing both a physiologic fatigue and some secondary fatigue too. We do check for things like anemia, like you mentioned earlier, and the caller mentioned earlier, and we check things like the thyroid, which is a gland that sits on your neck and
Hmm.
it produces a pretty important hormone. When you don't have it, you really feel awful. There's not really any exclusive feature to having low thyroid, and so a lot of that is it sounds like based on the history you're giving us, it could be an issue. So we ask about feeling fatigued and sometimes weight gain, changes in skin and nails, and even feeling like you're cold a lot. Those could be symptoms of low thyroid, and so that's also checked with a blood test as well. And it's easy to know, oh, is your thyroid abnormal? And if it is, then we can do some more investigation. Sometimes, based on like a physical exam, we'll check the neck, and if it's enlarged, then we think maybe they have what's known as a goiter or an enlarged thyroid, and so we can do some other testing on that as well.
You referenced the fact that a lot of people too over the age of 40 see this. Now, I can remember being 20 some years old, and I could work in a radio newsroom in one city, drive 25 miles away, and work another 8 hours in another city for a little extra dough. And I would do that about 3 times a week. Plus, I'd work weekends. I didn't think about when you're young sometimes, and you're not too wise about these things, going out and carousing with friends and getting by on 2, 3 hours sleep some days, and you wouldn't notice it. But it does. You do hit an age. There's like you hit a wall almost where you can't do certain things any longer. If you're working two jobs, it's going to wear you down, and you're going to have those fatigue issues.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we all, I think, get to that point where we think, okay, this is the point where I'm starting to understand what people said when they couldn't do anymore. I think a lot of us experienced that, and I did. In my early 20s and late teens, we I could stay up all night studying for a test, do the test, and not feel like I needed to go take a nap. But now, I don't know. I guess it's you know, like you said, one of those things that changes with age, and I think a lot of people do experience that.
But when you're doing it when you're young, is that doing any long term harm, and will it help cause it later in life?
I think that most things do have a cumulative effect over the lifetime. I think most of the time it's really just creating these cycles and these patterns that if you're not having a good having good sleep hygiene, good sleep cycles as a youth, you usually don't carry good sleep hygiene and good sleep cycles into adulthood and later on into your 30s, 40s, and 50s. I mean, I think that those are really hard habits to break. So I think more that's the issue that a lot of people deal with is just developing good sleep hygiene habits.
And staying, keeping that schedule. I do that on weekends too, as well. I don't sleep in even though I could because it would readjust my clock, so to speak. And
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the sleep hygiene I'm talking about. We really advise patients to be cognizant of when they're waking up, when they're going to bed, and kind of maintaining a really similar schedule on a day-to-day basis, even on the weekends, because you know our body gets used to it, and as soon as we change it, then it's hard to get back on track and hard to get restful sleep. So if you're struggling with sleeping, if you're struggling with getting enough rest, then definitely evaluate how you're getting ready for bed, when you're doing it, what kind of activities you're doing. Like, we have a lot of people nowadays, especially with smartphones and tablets, it's right there at the bedside, and it's tough to put them down, especially if you can't sleep. You go to your smartphone or your tablet and you say, "Oh, what's going on in the news today?" Or there's always someone awake around the world, and there's always news being generated, so there's always something to read. And so I think a lot of people they struggle with that. So we really advise people to get those electronics out of their room and get TVs out of their room and things like that, and just use your bed for sleeping. It doesn't need to be a couch.
Right, right. Yeah, a lot of people who decide to put a television in the room, or even your luminous clocks any longer. I mean, there's light sources and the cell phone going bleep, bloop, bloop all night long would do that. Want to thank Jeremy Daly for coming by today. And next week, gosh, the day before Thanksgiving already, we'll be talking about carcinogens. Want to remind you, Tripp Family Medicine, located on Fillmore Street, directly across from the main post office right here in Twin Falls. Got a guest coming up, I believe, from City Hall shortly. Also, another guest later in the program, joining us all the way from Delaware. He's what you'd call a legal maverick. Well, maybe he won't like that description, but we'll share more of that with you a bit later.